Stay with me until the end, because this one truth will change how you see everything you went through. The truth about relationships built on ego and control is that they leave people asking questions long after the ending. One of the most common questions sounds something like this: does the person who hurt me ever feel ashamed of how they treated you? It is an understandable question, because when you have poured your heart, your trust, and your emotional energy into someone who repeatedly dismissed your feelings, twisted your reality, or made you doubt your own worth, you naturally want to believe that one day they will finally realize the damage they caused. But understanding how these personalities operate means separating hope from reality. Shame, guilt, regret, and accountability are not the same thing. And confusing these emotions can keep you emotionally tied to someone who is incapable of giving you the closure you deserve. The purpose of this conversation is not to help you understand them so you can fix them. It is to help you understand them so you can finally set yourself free. Education is one of the greatest forms of emotional protection. The more clearly you understand what is happening beneath the surface, the less likely you are to personalize their behavior or blame yourself for the pain they created. One of the biggest misconceptions is that these individuals never experience shame at all. The reality is far more layered. At the core of these personalities lies an overwhelming fear of being exposed as inadequate, flawed, or unworthy. Healthy people can acknowledge imperfections without feeling completely destroyed by them. They understand that making a mistake does not define their entire identity. Someone with these traits often experiences flaws in a very different way. To them, admitting they hurt someone may feel like admitting they are fundamentally broken at their core. Because that emotional experience feels so threatening, they build powerful psychological defenses to avoid facing it. Instead of saying, "I made a mistake," they convince themselves that someone else caused the problem. Instead of feeling vulnerable, they become defensive. Instead of owning responsibility, they rewrite history. This is why people who have been close to these personalities often feel deeply confused. They expect the same emotional process they would have if they had hurt someone. But those defenses interrupt the process long before genuine accountability can ever occur. When shame begins to surface, it rarely looks like sadness or sincere remorse. Instead, it often disguises itself as anger, criticism, blame, or control. This is one of the most important ideas to understand because many survivors mistake these reactions for confidence or indifference. In truth, these behaviors often function as emotional armor. Imagine looking into a mirror that reflects every hurtful thing you have done. A healthy person may feel uncomfortable, but they can eventually accept the reflection and grow from it. Someone with these traits often cannot tolerate that mirror at all. Rather than changing themselves, they try to break the mirror. They criticize the people who challenge them. They attack those who hold them accountable. They spread rumors or portray themselves as the victim. These behaviors are not signs of strength. They are signs of emotional avoidance. The louder they blame others, the harder they may be working to silence the shame they cannot face. Watch this part carefully because it will click something many people miss. Understanding this does not excuse their behavior, but it explains why real change is often so rare. Many people wait years hoping for the moment when the other person will finally apologize, admit the truth, or acknowledge the pain they caused. While genuine apologies are possible in healthy dynamics, they are far less common when these patterns are deeply established. Feeling ashamed is not the same thing as taking responsibility. A person may privately experience discomfort, embarrassment, or even regret while still refusing to admit they were wrong. Why? Because acknowledging the truth threatens the carefully constructed image they have spent years protecting. Instead of apologizing, they may minimize your pain, justify their actions, or insist that you misunderstood everything. They may even accuse you of being the hurtful one. This leaves survivors questioning their own memories and wondering whether they imagined the abuse. This is why education is so powerful. Once you recognize these patterns, you stop expecting accountability from someone whose emotional survival depends on avoiding it. You no longer waste years waiting for words that may never come. One of the most surprising truths is that your healing can become one of the strongest reminders of their hidden shame. When you stop chasing them, stop defending yourself, stop arguing, and begin rebuilding your confidence, you quietly remove the role they expected you to play. These dynamics often rely on emotional dependence. They expect you to keep seeking approval, explaining yourself, or hoping they will eventually become the person you believed they could be. But when you begin living peacefully without them, something shifts. Your growth becomes evidence that their control is no longer working. You become a living reminder that their version of the story was never the whole truth. This does not mean they will suddenly admit everything they did. In many cases, they may become more dismissive, more critical, or even try to re-enter your life. These reactions are not necessarily proof of love or genuine remorse. More often, they reflect discomfort with losing the influence they once held over you. Here is the greatest lesson of all. Your healing must never depend on another person's self-awareness. Waiting for someone to admit they hurt you places your emotional future in the hands of a person who has repeatedly demonstrated an inability to provide emotional safety. That is a painful position to stay in, but it is also one you have the power to leave. Your value has never depended on their apology. Your truth has never depended on their agreement. Your recovery has never required their permission. The strongest form of closure is not hearing them finally say, "I was wrong." The strongest form of closure is reaching a point where those words are no longer necessary for your peace. That is emotional freedom. That is reclaiming your identity. And that is the moment the connection truly loses its power over you. When you invest your energy in understanding yourself, instead of understanding why they refuse to change, you begin building a life defined not by the pain they caused, but by the strength, wisdom, and resilience you discovered while overcoming it. That is a victory no one can ever take away from you. Have you ever found yourself lying awake at night, wondering if the person who hurt you ever thinks about what they did? Maybe you replay conversations in your mind, searching for the moment everything shifted. Maybe you ask yourself whether they ever experience guilt, regret, or shame for the way they twisted your words, dismissed your feelings, or made you question your own reality. These questions are incredibly common because emotional mistreatment rarely ends with clear answers. Instead, it leaves behind confusion, self-doubt, and an overwhelming need to understand what really happened. But before we can answer whether shame is felt at all, we first have to understand what shame actually is and how it differs from guilt and accountability. These words are often used interchangeably, but psychologically they describe very different experiences. Healthy shame is an uncomfortable emotional signal that tells us we have acted in a way that conflicts with our values. It encourages reflection, empathy, and growth. Guilt says, "I did something wrong." Healthy accountability says, "I recognize the harm I caused. I take responsibility, and I want to make things right." These emotional processes help people repair bonds and grow into better versions of themselves. They require humility, honesty, and the willingness to sit with uncomfortable emotions without running away. Most emotionally healthy people are capable of this, even though it is not easy. These personalities often struggle with this process because their emotional world is built around protecting a fragile sense of self. While they may appear confident, superior, or even invincible on the outside, many experts explain that this outward image functions as a defense against deep feelings of inadequacy and vulnerability. To someone with strong traits, admitting fault can feel less like acknowledging a mistake and more like admitting they are fundamentally worthless. That emotional experience becomes so threatening that the mind automatically builds walls to push shame away before it can be consciously processed. This is why people are often confused after confronting them about hurtful behavior. Instead of hearing, "You are right, I am sorry," they offer excuses, blame, denial, or attacks. The conversation suddenly becomes about your flaws instead of their actions. They may insist you misunderstood them, accuse you of being too sensitive, or claim that everything was actually your fault. These reactions are not signs of emotional maturity. They are protective strategies designed to keep painful reflection at a safe distance. Understanding this difference is incredibly important because many survivors mistakenly believe that if they could simply explain themselves better, provide more evidence, or remain patient long enough, the other person would eventually understand the pain they caused. Unfortunately, emotional insight cannot be forced onto someone whose defenses are built around avoiding it. The more directly their behavior threatens their carefully constructed self-image, the more likely they are to become defensive rather than reflective. This realization can feel disappointing at first, but it is also deeply liberating. It means their refusal to acknowledge your pain is not proof that your experience was not real. It is not evidence that you deserved the mistreatment or that you failed to communicate effectively. It often reflects their inability to tolerate the emotional discomfort that genuine accountability requires. Once you understand that difference, you stop measuring your worth by their willingness to admit the truth. Instead, you begin trusting your own experiences, honoring your own healing, and recognizing that real closure does not always come from another person's apology. Sometimes it comes from understanding why that apology may never arrive and choosing to move forward anyway. That shift in perspective is where true emotional freedom begins. One of the most confusing experiences for people recovering from this kind of mistreatment is witnessing the dramatic reactions that follow even the smallest amount of accountability. You may calmly point out a hurtful comment, remind them of a promise they broke, or explain how their behavior affected you, expecting a mature conversation. Instead, they suddenly become angry, defensive, dismissive, or even cruel. In some cases, they raise their voice, accuse you of attacking them, bring up mistakes you made years ago, or completely change the subject. To someone who has never encountered these patterns before, these reactions can seem irrational. But when viewed through the lens of these defensive patterns, they begin to make more sense. What appears to be confidence or emotional strength is often a desperate attempt to escape feelings they cannot comfortably face. One of those feelings is shame. Shame is one of the most painful emotions a person can experience because it does not simply say, "I made a mistake." It whispers, "There is something fundamentally wrong with me." Emotionally healthy people can usually separate their actions from their identity. They understand that making poor decisions does not make them permanently bad or unworthy. This allows them to apologize, learn, and grow without feeling emotionally destroyed. Someone with strong traits, however, often struggles to make this distinction. Their self-image depends heavily on appearing successful, superior, intelligent, admired, or morally right. Anything that threatens this carefully protected image can feel unbearable. Rather than sitting with those uncomfortable feelings, they instinctively defend themselves. Unfortunately, these defenses rarely look like vulnerability. Instead, they often appear as anger, criticism, blame, control, or emotional withdrawal. For example, if you confront them about lying, they may accuse you of being paranoid. If you express sadness over how they treated you, they may call you overly emotional or dramatic. If you establish a healthy boundary, they may suddenly portray you as selfish or uncaring. These reactions shift attention away from their behavior and place the emotional burden back onto you. This pattern is known as psychological projection. Instead of recognizing qualities they cannot accept within themselves, they unconsciously assign those qualities to someone else. They may call you manipulative while manipulating you. They may accuse you of being controlling while trying to dominate every decision. They may insist that you are dishonest while hiding the truth themselves. For survivors, this creates enormous confusion because they begin questioning their own perception of reality. Over time, this self-doubt becomes one of the most damaging consequences of emotional mistreatment. Another common defense is the need to maintain control. If acknowledging your pain would require admitting they behaved unfairly, they may instead intensify controlling behaviors. This could involve giving you the silent treatment, criticizing your achievements, spreading false stories about you, or trying to regain your attention after periods of distance. These actions are not evidence that they have developed empathy. More often, they are attempts to restore the emotional balance that protects them from confronting uncomfortable truths. Understanding these reactions is incredibly empowering because it changes the question you ask yourself. Instead of wondering, why are they acting this way? You begin asking, what are they avoiding? That shift allows you to stop personalizing every insult, every accusation, and every attempt to undermine your confidence. Their reactions become information rather than definitions of your worth. Most importantly, recognizing these patterns reminds you that another person's inability to face their own shame should never become your responsibility to fix. You cannot heal someone by absorbing their blame, accepting their projections, or sacrificing your own emotional well-being. Real healing begins when you stop chasing understanding from the person who created the confusion and start trusting the clarity that comes from educating yourself. The more you understand these emotional defenses, the less power they have over your thoughts, your confidence, and your future. One of the hardest truths to accept after leaving is that someone can privately experience moments of shame without ever becoming accountable for the harm they caused. Many survivors hold on to hope because they believe that if the other person feels bad enough, an apology will eventually come. They imagine a day when they will call, admit everything, acknowledge the pain they caused, and finally provide the validation they have been longing for. This hope is understandable because healthy relationships teach us that remorse often leads to repair. When emotionally healthy people realize they have hurt someone they care about, they usually feel empathy, accept responsibility, and make a sincere effort to change. They understand that love includes accountability. Unfortunately, this pattern often follows a very different path. Someone may experience moments of discomfort when they lose a relationship, damage their reputation, or realize they no longer have influence over someone they once controlled. However, that discomfort does not automatically become genuine responsibility. Instead of asking themselves, how did my behavior hurt this person? They are more likely to ask, how has this situation affected me? This difference is critical because it reveals where their emotional attention is focused. Their concern is often centered on the consequences they are experiencing rather than the pain someone else endured. They may miss the admiration, attention, convenience, or control that the connection provided, but that does not necessarily mean they have developed empathy for the person they mistreated. This is why many survivors become confused when the other person suddenly reaches out after months or even years of silence. The message may sound warm, nostalgic, or even apologetic at first. They may say they have been thinking about you, that they miss you, or that they wish things had turned out differently. While these words can feel meaningful, it is important to look beyond the language and observe the pattern. Does the conversation include specific accountability, or is it filled with vague statements? Do they acknowledge your pain without making excuses, or do they quickly shift the focus back to themselves? Genuine accountability is detailed, consistent, and accompanied by changed behavior. Empty remorse is often emotional in the moment, but disappears as soon as they regain a sense of control. Another reason accountability is so difficult is that admitting wrongdoing threatens the identity they have carefully built over many years. They often see themselves as the victim, the hero, the misunderstood one, or the one who was unfairly treated. Accepting responsibility would require dismantling that story and facing uncomfortable truths about themselves. For someone whose self-worth depends on maintaining a flawless image, this can feel emotionally overwhelming. As a result, they may rewrite history instead. They may claim you exaggerated what happened, insist that you forced them to behave that way, or remind you of your own mistakes to avoid discussing theirs. These strategies protect their self-image, but they prevent genuine growth. For survivors, this reality can be heartbreaking because it means the closure they seek may never arrive in the form they imagined. But there is also freedom in understanding it. The absence of accountability is not evidence that your pain was insignificant. It is not proof that your memories are inaccurate or that your feelings are invalid. It is simply a reflection of another person's emotional limitations. Once you recognize this, you stop waiting for someone else to confirm what you already know to be true. You begin trusting your own experience instead. Your healing no longer depends on hearing the words, "I was wrong." It depends on believing yourself, honoring your journey, and recognizing that your peace is too valuable to leave in the hands of someone unwilling to take responsibility for their actions. That realization marks the beginning of true emotional independence. One of the most powerful moments in your healing journey is when you begin to change. Not for them, not to prove a point, and not to win them back, but for yourself. At first, this transformation is often quiet. You stop responding to every message. You stop defending yourself against false accusations. You stop explaining your boundaries over and over again. You begin investing your energy into your own well-being instead of constantly managing someone else's emotions. While these changes may seem small, they represent a profound shift in the dynamic. The person who once depended on your reactions, your attention, and your emotional availability suddenly finds that the old strategies no longer work. For someone with strong traits, this can be deeply unsettling because your healing becomes a mirror reflecting something they have spent years trying to avoid. One of the defining characteristics of these dynamics is the imbalance of power. One side often occupies the position of authority, while the other remains focused on earning approval, preventing conflict, or restoring harmony. Over time, this creates an unhealthy cycle in which one person's emotional needs dominate, while the other is consistently ignored. When you begin healing, that cycle starts to break. You no longer seek constant reassurance from them. You stop measuring your worth by their opinions. You recognize that your peace is more valuable than winning another argument. This emotional independence changes things in ways they may not have anticipated. Your growth can trigger feelings of discomfort because it challenges the story they have been telling themselves. If they convince themselves that you were weak, incapable, or dependent on them, your recovery contradicts that belief. Every healthy boundary you maintain, every goal you accomplish, and every moment of happiness you experience without their involvement becomes evidence that you were never as powerless as they wanted you to believe. For someone who relies on maintaining a sense of superiority, this can quietly stir the shame they have spent years suppressing. Rather than confronting that discomfort directly, they may respond with actions designed to regain a sense of control. Sometimes they try to re-enter your life unexpectedly. They may send a casual message, comment on your social media, or ask mutual friends about you. Other times, they may become unusually critical, spreading rumors or minimizing your accomplishments. In some situations, they may suddenly appear unusually kind, generous, or nostalgic, hoping to recreate the emotional bond that once gave them influence. These actions can easily be mistaken for love, regret, or genuine change. But it is important to evaluate them carefully. True change is demonstrated through consistent accountability, empathy, and long-term behavioral transformation, not through temporary gestures that disappear once they regain your attention. It is also important to understand that your healing is not an act of revenge. The goal is not to make them jealous, guilty, or ashamed. If your recovery becomes focused on proving something to them, they still occupy the center of your emotional world. Real healing happens when your attention shifts completely away from their reactions and toward your own growth. You begin making decisions because they align with your values, not because you hope someone else will notice them. Your confidence no longer depends on whether they approve of your choices or acknowledge your progress. There is something incredibly empowering about reaching a place where another person's inability to value you no longer determines how you see yourself. You stop asking whether they finally realize what they lost and start appreciating what you have gained. You gain clarity instead of confusion. You gain self-respect instead of self-doubt. You gain healthy relationships built on mutual respect rather than emotional control. Most importantly, you gain the freedom to build a future that is no longer defined by someone else's limitations. Whether they ever fully confront their hidden shame is ultimately their responsibility, not yours. Your responsibility is to continue growing, protecting your peace, and remembering that the greatest victory is not watching someone else regret losing you. It is reaching the point where your happiness no longer depends on whether they ever do. Perhaps the most life-changing realization is this: your healing cannot depend on another person's willingness to admit the truth. As long as you are waiting for an apology, waiting for validation, or waiting for someone to finally acknowledge the pain they caused, your emotional well-being remains connected to a person who has repeatedly shown an unwillingness to provide the understanding you deserve. This does not mean your desire for closure is wrong.